Neanderthals are one of the great mysteries of human evolution. They're our closest relatives, but even while we're learning more about them every day, we know shockingly little about their habits. But we do know a little about what they did in the bedroom. And while that may seem like an unusual area of study, researchers have been able to use that information to learn more about early human history. So, today we're getting down and dirty with everything we know about the sex lives of Neanderthals. But before we do the deed, why don't you hit that subscribe button? Then head down to the comments and let us know what other aspects of prehistoric society you would like to hear about. For now, if you see this cave a-rockin', don't come a-knockin'. So let's just get this out of the way. Human beings definitely slept with Neanderthals. And when we say human beings definitely slept with Neanderthals, we're not talking about a bumbling ex-boyfriend failing a lie detector test on Maury Povich. Even though modern humans and Neanderthals are different species, that didn't stop the two from occasionally hooking up. DNA testing on the remains of a 40,000-year-old human revealed at least 11% of the genome was Neanderthal instead of the expected human. This proves the fact that humans and Neanderthals did indeed share a bed, or slab, or whatever got them in the mood back then. While this discovery is so far the most Neanderthal DNA ever found in a human, there are plenty of people alive today who still have remnants of Neanderthal in their genes. So maybe Maury was onto something with that ex-boyfriend. But we tend to think of Neanderthals as having lived in the distant past, reaching their height well before the era of humans. So you might assume that any meet-cute between humans and Neanderthals would have been extremely isolated. Perhaps something that occurred in the short time between Neanderthals' extinction and modern humans' prominence. Or perhaps something like the plot of the 2014 film Two Night Stand. Well, you would be incorrect about the meet-cute part, not about Two Night Stand. First of all, it may surprise you to learn that Neanderthals and humans coexisted on the planet for a pretty long while, just a blink in geologic terms, but plenty of time for knocking some prehistoric boots. Secondly, these interspecies mixers happened with some regularity. Based on DNA evidence, scientists believe that thousands of these couplings happened over tens of thousands of years, a discovery that revolutionized our understanding of our own history. For example, researchers have subsequently been able to determine that, since Neanderthals never lived in Africa, Homo Sapiens must have left Africa and migrated to Eurasia earlier than we thought, at least 100,000 years ago. But some other implications of this evidence are more grim. Despite the fact that they look similar enough to be in a buddy comedy together, Neanderthals and humans were completely different species. Communication between the two would have been difficult, if not impossible, meaning it's unlikely the two hominids hooked up by choice. If this was the case, then it could be evidence that humans and Neanderthals had a violent and competitive relationship, one that would end with humans emerging as the sole survivors. You can thank our Neanderthal forefathers for innovations such as fire, the wheel, and the rudimentary building blocks of society. They're also responsible for another, much less useful gift: genes that cause ulcers to generate on human genitalia. Thanks, we guess? Maybe just send an Amazon card next time. A gene called HLA-B51, which made its way into humans thanks to all of that cave swinging back in the day, and has passed down from generation to generation ever since, has been known to cause Behçet's disease, a condition that involves painful, inflamed sores on someone's mouth, eyes, and yes, genitalia. And that's if you're lucky. The unlucky sufferers of Behçet's disease also develop blood clots, aneurysms, or full-on blindness. But Behçet's disease isn't the only gift from our Neanderthal grandparents. You can also thank them for Crohn's disease, lupus, and diabetes, all ailments that can be traced back to ancient DNA. Like that mosquito in Jurassic Park if, instead of dinosaurs, it gave John Hammond West Nile virus. When it comes to genetic afflictions, our ancestors spared no expense. Modern humans and Neanderthals differ in a lot of different ways, from our behavior and bone structures to our love of iced coffees and current status of extinction. And one of the most severe differences between the two species is the perspective on pursuing sexual relationships with close relatives. Unless you're one of the Lannisters, in which case you're probably asking what the big deal is. After a female Neanderthal toe bone was discovered in a Siberian cave, genetic analysis was able to determine that the specimen, we'll call her Toeless Tina, had parents who were very closely related to each other. either half-siblings or an aunt and nephew. Either way, it was presumably an awkward household. Scientists went on to discover that the level of inbreeding on this particular specimen was unusually high, not just for this species, but for any species. This suggests inbreeding was less of a fluke and more of just how Neanderthals behaved. It could also explain the litany of genetic disorders found in Neanderthal DNA, as inbreeding is known to cause a number of health issues in humans, such as congenital birth defects. Not that we're comparing or anything, but it is important to note, for totally scientific and historical reasons, that Neanderthal males were found to be packing pretty much the same sized gunny sack as modern humans, euphemistically speaking. By comparing DNA, scientists figured out that male Neanderthal sex organs were likely indistinguishable from those of present-day men. This makes sense given the sheer amount of inbreeding between the two species, and further differentiates Neanderthals from other primates who have proportionately smaller genitalia. But don't get cocky, or don't let it go to your head. Just be cool about it, okay? In case you haven't observed, the Neanderthals are gone, and they're never coming back. We understand if you want to cry a little. Scientists have puzzled for many years trying to piece together the source of their extinction. Was it climate change, the rise of an apex predator, or did humans do what humans do best and wipe out the competition? Well, one hypothesis floating around the scientific community is that the Neanderthals never actually died out, but instead just blended in with us via many years of interspecies mating until they were completely assimilated, like the Borg or those cavemen in the Geico commercials. In other words, by getting together with humans, they may have sexed themselves out of existence. Oh, what a way to go. The Neanderthals left behind a lot of genetic evidence for us to find, but despite all that DNA, the mystery of their disappearance is one that still puzzles scientists to this day. We don't know a ton about the day-to-day personal lives of Neanderthals aside from the fact that they mingled with humans. And picture some air quotes around the word mingled, because we're talking about the kind of mingling adults do while the kids are at baseball camp. However, apart from the scientific evidence that they did knock boots with humans, nobody knows under what conditions, or what it might have looked like. Although we imagine somewhere someone has drawn a picture of it. Hopefully, with more time and more discoveries, we'll learn even more about how Neanderthals did the nasty, and in turn, learn more about our own history. We think they would have wanted it that way. From the time of Henry VIII, lustful contact between two men was outlawed, and often punishable by death, due to the Buggery Act of 1533. While female ladies of the night did face trouble in rough conditions at the hands of police, things were much worse for London's male workers. Today, we're exploring the story of London's 18th century molly houses. Let's take a trip to London's secret past. The English have a knack for inventing new slang. This was especially true in the late 17th century when the word Molly emerged as a slang term referring to gay or effeminate men. According to Cassell's Dictionary of Slang, variations of the word like Moll and Miss Molly came to essentially mean the same thing. By the 18th century, the word took on a different meaning entirely, as slang for a male prostitute. The word Molly could also refer to a lower-class woman or a prostitute during the same time period. But mostly, it was associated with effeminate men who today might identify as LGBTQ. In the safety of a Molly house, Molly boys could cross-dress and perform in drag in relative secrecy. They sometimes adopted fake names to liven the festivities. It wasn't unlikely to find monikers like Plump Nellie, Susan Guzzle, Primrose Mary, and the Duchess of Chamomile. But there was one who stood out in the crowd, Princess Serafina. She liked to attend events at the Molly houses so she could dance with fine gentlemen. She dressed and acted the same way in her home life, and even sued a man in 1732 for stealing one of her gowns. Her neighbors described her commonly wearing a white gown and scarlet cloak. While in drag, Mollies held masquerade balls and delighted in having a safe place to dress and act how they pleased. In the 18th century, the curious macaroni fashion trend became quite popular, leading to more breathing room for some men to act and dress how they desired. Macaronis were men who dressed extravagantly, often in feminine ways. This style gave mollies an opportunity to avoid hiding their appearances. but they still had to conceal their relationships. At the same time, the phrase Molly House came about to describe the coffee shops, inns, taverns, and other safe places where gay men met in secret. Some were even located in private homes. Houses were safe spaces during a dangerous time in history, and they were intended for more than just meeting a date. They were safe haven during a time when any physical contact between two men might be punished by hanging. When London society began to turn against macaronis in the 1770s, the houses offered a way for London's LGBTQ+ population to socialize in peace. Randolph Trumbach, the first historian to uncover London's Molly houses, discovered patrons often used code words to describe the establishments. Margaret Clapp's house was often referred to as a coffee house. Other Molly houses were taverns with secret back rooms where London's LGBTQ+ population could meet with privacy and discretion. These rooms also had secret codes. They were called chapels, and visitors might engage in mock marriages or other activities. Dancing, socializing, and dressing in drag were common activities in Molly houses as well. Due to the lingering threat of execution, Molly boys didn't really keep records. But historical accounts from the period show that Molly houses were about more than hooking up. While they undoubtedly served this purpose, historian Richter Norton argues that same-gender prostitution wasn't the typical use for Molly houses. They were mostly for men to congregate in a safe environment. Unfortunately, outsiders didn't see much difference between consensual relationships and solicitation. They began using phrases like he-strumpets and he-whores to imply the male patrons were prostitutes themselves, even though most of them were just there to meet and socialize. Part of that socialization included a healthy dose of alcohol. The Molly House wasn't just a safe place for men to meet each other in secret. It was also a place to drink and engage in social activities. These alcoholic antics got one man, Thomas Wright, into big trouble. During his 1726 trial, a Molly boy named Thomas Newton testified against Wright. Newton was a Molly boy employed by Wright, who later testified against his former partners in exchange for immunity. Wright was a woolcomber who ran a busy Molly house on the side. While his place wasn't considered an alehouse, Wright obtained ale from other places to sell at his establishment. The sale of that beer supported his own Beech Lane house, where he kept rooms for the entertainment of the mollyculls. Newton further incriminated Wright, stating, "He has often fetched me to oblige company that way, and especially to one Gregory Turner, who commonly chose me for his sweetheart." Unfortunately, this spelled certain death for Wright. He was convicted and executed at Tyburn in 1726. But that didn't stop Newton from incriminating others down the line. Walking through certain parts of London during the 18th century offered a simple way to meet other men. Streets like the one near Moorfield Park were major cruising areas and had nicknames like the Sodomites' Walk. Other streets, like Cox Lane or Lad Lane, hinted that Molly boys might be found there. Molly houses naturally sprung up around these areas. Their proximity to these well-known streets made it easier for men to meet and go to a house in relative privacy. Thomas Newton eventually let 2 constables follow him as he tried to find men to take to his Molly house. Those men were then taken in by the police. One man who was entrapped by Newton was William Brown. When asked why he met with Newton in Moorfield Park, he explained he thought he knew him and believed there is no crime in making what use I please of my own body. At his July 1726 trial, Brown's official defense was that he'd been innocently urinating on the wall and was a happily married man. The jury found him guilty, sentencing him to stand in a Moorfield pillory, pay a 10-mark fine, and go to jail for 2 months. But Newton's efforts to entrap others to save his own skin was only the beginning. Things got much worse from there. Thomas Newton was one of only a few Molly boys who walked London streets in search of customers. In some cases, he picked them up and led them straight to the authorities. But sometimes the police came right to the Molly houses. In the 1720s, police raided 17 houses over a 2-year period. One of the most notorious raids was on Mother Clapp's house, in which 30 men were taken and thrown into Newgate Prison. At their trials, the men testified that Mother Clapp provided both alcohol and lodgings at her house, where 30 or 40 men would often hang out every night. The trials ended in some men being released for lack of evidence, while others were sent to prison, paid fines, or humiliated in pillories. 3 men, Gabriel Lawrence, William Griffin, and Thomas Wright, were hanged on May 9, 1726. The saddest part of the whole story is that Mother Claps probably never would have been raided if it hadn't been for someone's jealous lover. Following a quarrel with his lover, Mr. Harrington, Mark Partridge turned his back on the Molly houses and became a police informant. Angry about his lover for telling someone about their relationship, Partridge decided to spread vicious rumors about his lover. Among other things, Partridge claimed Harrington was a regular patron of quite a few different houses. Then things got out of hand. The rumor grew quickly outside the Molly subculture, prompting police to contact Partridge. In becoming an informant, Partridge betrayed the trust of the other members of his community. But his treachery didn't stop there. He also began to actively lead constables to various Molly houses he knew about and went to in the past. He'd introduced the undercover policeman as his husband to grant them access to the inside. It was Partridge who initially led constables, Joseph Sellers and William Davison, to Thomas Wright's Beach Lane house. Inside, the other men called him a treacherous, blowing up, mollying bitch, and threatened to kill him. The crowd relaxed when he successfully blamed Harrington for the betrayal, saying he was responsible for letting the secret first. The crowd kissed him and the undercover constables, unaware the house was about to be raided. Police went to great lengths to protect Partridge, with some court reports using only his first initial instead of a complete name. Among the drinking and dancing in the houses, men also laid with each other. This really bothered Sellers, who later testified about what he saw in Wright's Molly house. There I found a company of men fiddling and dancing and singing bawdy songs, kissing and using their hands in a very unseemly manner. The idea of such goings-on offended Sellers and many others who took action. It got so bad, a religious organization called the Societies for Reformation of Manners regularly sent undercover agents to infiltrate and shut down any Molly houses they could. But those raids had devastating consequences for the men who were caught in the midst of them. The Molly houses were meant to provide refuge and safety for the Mollies, but when police raided Molly houses, it could often end lives. In a 1728 raid reported in the British Gazetteer, the police raided Jonathan Muff's house near Whitechapel Church. Jonathan, also known as Miss Muff, was apprehended along with 9 other Molly boys, whom they referred to as male ladies. After they were jailed, different fates befell each. 2 of them faced a whipping, while 2 others were acquitted. A 5th individual was fined. One man, Thomas Mitchell, tried to take his own life while in prison. Thomas Mitchell attempted to end his life in prison, but the doctors prevented him from succeeding. The British Gazetteer wrote of Mitchell, he attempted and had near accomplished destroying himself in cutting the great artery of his left arm almost asunder. But by the immediate help of some eminent surgeons, he was preserved, though at the point of death, through the great effusion of blood. Not much is known about the fate of the others. Eventually, the death penalty part of the Buggery Act was eliminated in 1861. Despite a tumultuous time in the early 1700s, houses began to reappear around 1750, but eventually faded into British history.
The Puritans were a society of English Protestants who had their heyday in the 16th and 17th centuries. They practically invented the idea of being uptight. As their name implies, Puritan attitudes toward sex were fairly buttoned up. But they came unbuttoned a lot more than you probably thought. So, today we're going undercover to reveal the surprising sex lives of Puritans. As Nathaniel Hawthorne probably said, I want your bad romance. Despite their stuffy reputation, you might be surprised to find out that the Puritans weren't anti-sex. In fact, they actually thought sex was pretty great. There are a ton of quotes from prominent Puritans singing the praises of steamy marital intimacy. For example, one wrote that sex should be like 2 musical instruments rightly fitted that make a most pleasant and sweet harmony in a well-tuned consort. So, like a mixtape. Then there was clergyman William Gouge, who described sex as one of the most proper and essential acts of marriage, and said married couples should go to bed with goodwill and delight, willingly, readily, and cheerfully. And in 1615, Puritan writer Alexander Nichols said that in marriage, thou not only unitest unto thyself a friend and comfort for society, but also a companion for pleasure. So in other words, knock ye boots, and knock ye often. The Puritans not only thought sex should be hot and joyful, they also believed regular slam dunks promoted good health. and that a mutual slam dunk was necessary for conception. Puritan medical texts even recommended good food, wine, a relaxed atmosphere, and foreplay to help married couples synchronize their dunks. We're really nailing this euphemism, pun intended. However, they were Puritans, so they didn't want anyone to have too much fun. For instance, they thought too much sex could cripple you, or shave years off of your life. Sure, but only if it's really good. Of course, the Puritans weren't quite so enthusiastic about all sex. Historical documents from the Plymouth colony show that premarital relations was a major taboo, which could result in harsh punishment. For example, back in 1640, Thomas and Joanne Pinson were busted for doing the deed before being married. Interestingly, we don't exactly know how they got caught, but it's possible Joanna's pregnancy may have shown only a few months after getting married, which would have been a dead giveaway. For their reckless romance, Tom was whipped at the post, while Joanne was made to sit in the stocks. Despite the harsh punishments, premarital hookups were common in Puritan Massachusetts. In Middlesex County, for example, 1 in every 200 births were conceived out of wedlock. Once charged, most such couples just confessed and were then given a choice between being whipped or fined. Men and women were considered equally at fault and were punished similarly for it. However, women were accused of sexual misdeeds more frequently. In fact, the double standard was so bad that there isn't a single case of a married man being accused of adultery in the court records. As historian Anna Newsel of the University of Virginia notes, illicit sexual intercourse, especially by married men, was most certainly a common occurrence. But men were accused of fornication, a less serious offense. The Puritans weren't just sex positive when it came to married couples. They were violently demanding on the subject, and would actually discipline men who weren't being intimate with their wives often enough. For example, in 1640, a man named James Maddock was excommunicated from his church in Boston because, among other things, he had denied conjugal fellowship unto his wife for 2 years. James claimed he was taking revenge upon himself for mistreating her before they were married, which is another way of saying he almost certainly had a mistress. And in 1665, one John Williams of Plymouth Colony was hauled into court because he was accused of sequestration of himself from the marriage bed and refusing to perform marriage duty towards his wife Elizabeth according to the law of God and man. John claimed he was actively trying to escape the relationship because Liz was unfaithful, but a jury eventually ruled in her favor, awarding her 1/3 of his estate plus living expenses. Talk about stiff. The Puritans' attitudes towards premarital sex were fairly intense, but in the whole history of the Plymouth colony, only one single person was ever put to death for a sex-related crime. The unlucky fellow was a teenager named Thomas Granger, who was hanged in 1621 after admitting it to doing the deed with a mare, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey. Sounds like someone needed to invest in a barn door. Granger's fellow Puritans were simply too puritanical to look the other way on this one, so he was whacked, along with every one of his animal companions. And not that anyone would after what happened to Thomas Granger, but you couldn't even joke about something considered so lewd. In at least one recorded case from the Puritan town of New Haven, a couple was run out of town after their dog got frisky with a neighbor's pig, and they cracked a joke. The Puritans would have had tremendous difficulty with some comedies from the 80s and 90s. Birth control methods of the day weren't terribly advanced, but they did exist, usually made from plants or animal intestines. Europeans, for example, used sheep gut condoms, and Iroquois women used birch bark sponges. But the Puritans were opposed to any and all forms of birth control, including coitus interruptus, which, if you don't speak Latin, is just the withdrawal method, the only one that doesn't require a trip to the drugstore. Genesis 38 mentions Onan bailing out, so to speak, and the Lord slew him over the whole thing, so it was pretty dang serious. Consequently, onanism was considered a hideous sin to the Puritans. Long story short, if you were a Puritan, the only form of birth control you could even attempt was to pray before you did the deed. Similarly, any kind of intimate contact beyond vaginal intercourse was considered a crime against God, because none of it can lead to procreation. So all other forms of intimacy were against the law. The Puritans called these laws buggery laws, which comes from the French slang word bourge, meaning heretical. One such form of forbidden intimacy was homosexuality. In fact, being gay was considered worse than adultery, the most abominable, unnatural sin. Despite the intense rhetoric, the Puritans only sentenced a single person to death for homosexuality, and probably because he was also openly atheist. Pretty much everyone got executed for that back then. In general, homosexuality was usually punished by comparatively lighter sentences, such as being burned on the shoulder, getting publicly whipped, or being banished from the colony, although that last one was essentially the same as death. It's not like you could go rent an apartment in the city. However, female homosexuality was only a capital crime from 1655 to 1665 in New Haven. All other Puritan legal codes meant to punish homosexuality by death applied only to men. We're pretty sure we don't want to know why, but in 1645, a strange piece of puritanical legislation outlawed the wearing of visors or masks and strange apparel to lascivious ends and purposes. In other words, you can't trick someone into sleeping with you by wearing a disguise. The legislation explains that some abuses have formerly broken out amongst us by disguising. The whole thing sounds pretty tawdry, but the law must have worked because, as one historian notes, no case of disguises being worn by masked lovers appears in the court records. So wearing disguises was out, but at least you could write the object of your affection a sexy note to entice them into a little something, right? Well, no. Take, for example, the case of Nathaniel Hall, a married man who was accused of using uncivil words and carriages towards Elizabeth Barry in person, and then later giving writings to the said Elizabeth Barry to entice her. We assume Elizabeth Barry was a server at the New Haven Chili's. It's the only case of its kind that we know of, but that didn't help Hall. He ultimately had to choose between a 5-pound fine or to be publicly whipped. Finally, bundling, or tarrying, was a common practice among the Puritans, and according to at least one expert, it almost certainly promoted unchastity. How did that work? Well, if a young woman's parents approved of her suitor, they would occasionally bundle them by putting them to bed together, the lady with only her underpetticoat on, and her sweetheart with nothing but his breeches. You know, as a treat. Sometimes a bundling board was used to separate the couple. Or in some cases, a sack, as seen in Roland Emmerich's 2000 movie, The Patriot. That's right, something in The Patriot was actually true. According to historian Andrew Gardner, this was a way to see if the couple was sexually compatible in a way that wouldn't upset the Lord. But there was some ground rules. Underclothes must be kept on at all times. Parents would retire to their own bedroom, and there should be no hanky-panky. We're willing to bet a few of those couples found a way to break the rules.
If we based our knowledge of the Roman Empire on film and television, we might believe the entire civilization was one big love fest, engaging in adult activities when they weren't battling each other in the Colosseum or racing their chariots through the streets. But in ancient Rome, sex was a bit more nuanced than simple lustful parties full of hedonistic desires and seductive grape eating. For all the indulgent free love they are known for, it wasn't so groovy if you were lower class or happened to be a conquered people. In other words, sex in Rome is complicated. So, today we're dividing the facts and conquering the history of what sex was like in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, if you were homosexual, there was no impetus to keep it a secret. It was totally cool, as long as one adhered to a few social mores. First, you pretty much had to be a dude. And because men and women were of different social standing in ancient Rome, woman-on-woman relationships were frowned upon, unless a man was involved. Women weren't considered dominant in society. And back then, dominance was the name of the game. If a fella engaged in same-gender relations, they had to be the dominant partner in the relationship, lest they lose their social standing. It's just business. This allowed the men of Rome to freely engage with whomever they pleased, including slaves and working girls. As long as the lovemaking included a man, as a symbol of power, everything was fair game. The Stoics of Rome were kind of like the Vulcans from Star Trek. They were big on emotional restraint and did not jibe with sexual relations for the sake of pleasure. You could do the deed, sure, but only as an act of affection that bonded people together, thus keeping a stable family unit and a happy society. This is all a pretty long-winded way of saying they had no game. Stoics believed that lovemaking was often an unnecessary desire that clouded judgment and reason. Thus, they emphasized equality of all people, including slaves and women, so that the deed did not infringe upon the freedom or will of any individual. The pre-Republic Rome was a nation of scoundrels who used their vast power to take whatever they wanted, be it territory, treasures, or people. The most infamous example of Rome flaunting its unquestionable power was in 750 BCE, when Romans decided they needed a population boost. That meant bad news for everyone close by. These pre-empire pillagers abducted many women from neighboring Sabine tribes, specifically for procreation, resulting in the forced births of many babies. Now, assaulting a free-born woman could get an ancient Roman in a lot of trouble. However, the saying, "all's fair in love and war," seemed to be the motto of Roman soldiers when they were pillaging foreign lands. Soldiers were paid through plunder, which meant they could forfeit their currency to instead lay claim to anything found in conquered lands. We're talking about precious metals, delicious foods, priceless art, and people. It didn't matter if those people were free-born, because at that point, they were conquered and considered slaves. Romans were free to do with them whatever they wanted. If those captives were lucky, this meant being sold off for a tidy profit. If not, woof. Entertainers in ancient Rome weren't the superstars they are today. People like theater performers, chariot racers, and gladiators were near the bottom rung of society, second only to slaves. But the people went and saw them. Gladiator battles, in particular, were top-tier entertainment in Roman society, and as could be expected, the gladiators who fought them were heavily desirable. Many women and men tried to indulge in their fantasies by sleeping with these performers, from the lowly commoner to the wives of prominent figures. In other words, it's like show business today. These casual meetups between warrior and superfan had to be discreet, or influential people would risk someone uncovering the scandalous rendezvous. Take the case of Faustina the Younger, the wife of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who would allegedly get real hot and bothered while watching gladiators beat the tar out of each other. Aurelius, at the end of his rope about the situation with his wife, consulted a soothsayer about what to do. The oracle suggested his wife go visit the gladiator, if you catch our drift, and she did. However, one caveat was introduced. The gladiator in question should be executed while lying on top of her, and Faustina should bathe in his blood afterwards. That is one intense oracle. Allegedly, this satisfied Faustina's wandering eye, allowing her and Marcus Aurelius to continue their marriage. Well, hopefully after a quick rinse in the basin. If you're a fan of locking lips, you can thank the Roman Empire for the privilege. The people of ancient Rome loved smooching so much that they spread kissing fever throughout the empire. And since Rome was the place to be, throughout the rest of the world, too. Kissing in Rome was such a popular pastime, they even codified it into law and social custom. Roman men reportedly had an obsession with locking lips that developed into a full-on oral fixation. There were guidelines on how it should be done, who you should and should not kiss, and which circumstances warranted a wet smackaroo. Probably the most famous custom regarding ancient Rome and kissing is the passionate one done at a wedding ceremony, a tradition that carries on to this day. Roman couples weren't shy about bringing others into their marital beds for a little late-night lovemaking. Whether man or woman, nobody really cared as long as everyone had a good time. These acts were common in the marriage of Emperor Hadrian, but just on his side. His wife and second cousin, Vibia Sabina, was not clued into these sexual excursions, though she likely realized something was up when Hadrian eventually found a soulmate in a teenage boy named Antinous. Antinous eventually disappeared, and Hadrian did what any grief-stricken emperor would do. He had him declared a god and ordered him worshipped throughout the empire. Normal breakup stuff. Back in Rome, there were magical virgins with important placement in society. Vestal virgins tended to the temple of Vesta, the Roman goddess of hearth, home, and family. The 6 Vestals were chosen when they were between 6 and 10 years old, and were symbolic protectors of Rome's spiritual security under the eyes of the gods. Honestly, that doesn't sound like a bad gig. Except the post was served for 30 years, the entirety of which they had to remain virgins. The women were off-limits to all Roman men, with a small asterisk that read, "Unless you're the emperor." Elagabalus, for example, totally ignored this rule and married a Vestal in order to get divine children. All it gave him was a bad reputation with the gods. Good one, Elagabalus. With great power comes great responsibility. That is a nice sentiment when spoken by the doomed uncle of a burgeoning superhero. But when put to the test in ancient Rome, great power produced some of the most depraved acts ever imagined. Take Nero, for example. Can't hear enough crazy stories about the guy who put out a hit on his pregnant wife. However, he allegedly loved this late wife so much that when he found a young man who kind of looked like her, he ordered him turned into a eunuch so the two could be wed. This new bride was forced to dress in all the late Mrs. Nero's clothing. On the other end of the deviant scale, Caligula was known to steal women away from their husbands, while also finding the time to sleep with his own sisters. While incest wasn't super widespread, and it was frowned upon, it did exist in ancient Rome. It can be hard to separate facts from myth, but it is believed that those who could get away with it had the tendency to date closer to home. A lot closer. Caligula also threw adults-only parties where just about every lustful whim was indulged, which may be why his name has almost become a shorthand for extreme depravity. But the worst of the worst had to be Emperor Tiberius, who seemed to want the top spot in the Deviants Hall of Fame. We can't get into any detail here. Suffice it to say that even the youngest of the young weren't spared from Tiberius's appetites. Back in the ancient days, the Romans were looking for lovin' anywhere they could, so people selling themselves to get the deed done didn't really offend anyone's sensibilities too much. These workers ranged from slaves to freed women to high-class beauties, all working the streets of Rome. Rome made the whole thing official in 40 CE, officially taxing the profession of sex work and cementing the oldest profession's place as a legitimate business. Emperor Augustus even enacted laws banning any moral penalties for these workers, giving them a pass from Rome's strict moral code. Hey, work is work, even in ancient times.
In the wild world of British royalty, where crowns are heavy, robes are plush, and palaces echo with secrets, it's hard not to wonder about the intimate escapades of kings and queens. The court's sensual subtext, often glossed over by official historians, offers a titillating peek into the human side of these lofty figures. From Henry VIII's notorious bed-hopping to Queen Victoria's passionate, albeit discreet, marital bliss, each monarch's private life reveals a saga of desire, scandal, and occasionally love. So, today on Weird History, we'll embark on a journey through the centuries, exploring the sex lives of the British monarchy. All right, royal subjects, heavy is the bed that wears the crown. Queen Victoria, the literal namesake of Victorian values, is a leader we often imagine as extremely buttoned up, with everything covered in a thick layer of royal propriety. But behind the stern facade of Britain's longest reigning queen was a woman of intense passion and fervent love for her husband, Prince Albert. Their marriage, often touted as the zenith of Victorian virtue, was anything but frigid. Victoria's diary entries, penned with the fervor of a romance novel, reveal a deeply affectionate relationship. On their wedding night, she wrote with breathless excitement, "I never spent such an evening. My dearest, dear Albert. His excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before." Whew! Did it suddenly get way hotter in here? The Queen's openness about her marital bliss was a stark contrast to the era's public prudishness. While the court upheld an image of stern morality, the royal bedchambers told a different story. Victoria and Albert's union was not just a political alliance, but also one of love, filled with intimate moments that defied the era's stiff upper lip stereotype. When Victoria first laid eyes on Albert in his white cashmere breeches, with nothing underneath, her heart, it seems, skipped a royal beat. Their love, far from diminishing with age, continued to flourish, much to the consternation of her prudish advisors. "Am I not to have any more fun in bed?" she lamented at the prospect of curbing her marital joys. Yet, for all their private passion, the Victorian court was a bastion of repression. Homosexual acts were criminalized in 1885, and the mere notion of women finding other women attractive was, according to an infamous urban myth, beyond the queen's comprehension. It's a wild juxtaposition. A queen who relished her own marital pleasures presiding over a society that shunned and condemned anyone deemed deviant. King George III, remembered for his bouts of madness and losing the American colonies, led an uneventful private life compared to his more flamboyant predecessors. George's reign was marked by an emphasis on piety and virtue, and his personal life mirrored this public image. Married to Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, George was a devoted husband. Their union produced an impressive 15 children, and remarkably for the time, George never took a mistress. Seems like a low bar to clear, but it was a stark contrast to the earlier and even later courts. Yet George's personal virtues were not enough to stave off his mental decline. His later years were marred by episodes of insanity, likely exacerbated by arsenic poisoning, though doctors Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter contend it was a simple case of porphyria, a condition that affects the skin and nervous system. Even so, his dedication to his wife and children remained unwavering, painting a picture of a monarch whose greatest battles were fought not on the fields of war, but within the confines of his mind. Charles II, known as the Merry Monarch, reigned over a veritable carnival of hedonism and debauchery. After years of puritanical repression under Oliver Cromwell, Charles's return to the throne in 1660 brought with it a renaissance of revelry. Charles's court was a playground of pleasures, with mistresses and illegitimates abound. His most notorious paramour, Barbara Villiers, was a woman of great beauty, enormously vivacious and ravenous, according to the Bishop of Salisbury. Villiers bore him 6 children, and her influence at court was as immense as her allure. Charles's laissez-faire attitude toward affairs also extended to his favorite actress, Nell Gwynn, whose wit and charm kept the court entertained both on and off the stage. Amidst this bacchanalia, one figure stands out, a doctor known simply as Colonel Condom, the royal protector of pleasure. Yes, Charles's court even boasted the inventor of the condom, ensuring that the Merry Monarch's escapades were both prolific and, we can hope, somewhat safe. To summarize Charles II's reign, we'll quote noted poet and libertine John Wilmot, 2nd Earl of Rochester. "We have a pretty witty king, whose word no man relies on. He never said a foolish thing, and never did a wise one." King George II presents a curious case of royal romance. Passionately in love with his wife, Queen Caroline, George also maintained a long-term mistress, Henrietta Howard. Caroline, known for her wit and intelligence, was by all accounts the true love of George's life. Their marriage, while politically advantageous, blossomed into a genuine partnership. But Henrietta was a constant presence in their lives. George's affection for her was genuine, though it never eclipsed his devotion to Caroline. Henrietta's intelligence and wit earned her the respect of literary luminaries like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, and her legacy endures in the architecture of Marble Hill House, a Palladian villa built in her honor. This ancient throuple managed to balance George's duties as king, husband, and lover, a testament to the complexities that royal relationships can bring. We too often think of them to be matters of convenience or political standing, a way to bridge nations or mend relationships. But often, the royals just like each other. The medieval court of Edward III, a tapestry of both chivalry and scandal, was a realm where strong-willed women wielded significant influence. Edward's mother, Isabella of France, orchestrated a coup that saw her lover, Roger Mortimer, rise to power, only for young Edward to later overthrow them and assert his rule. Edward's marriage to Philippa of Hainault was one of genuine affection, producing 14 children. However, the king's heart strayed in his later years to Alice Perrers, a vivacious young woman who captivated him. After Philippa's death, Alice's influence at court grew, symbolized by her golden attire and public parades. Edward's court, while often embroiled in power struggles and intrigue, also saw the flourishing of culture. Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, penned shortly after Edward's death, reflects the era's bawdy humor and complex social dynamics. Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII, embodied the spirit of indulgence and excess. Known as Bertie in his youth, Edward spent his days engaging in every pleasure imaginable, from gambling and horse racing to lavish parties and numerous affairs. Edward's marriage to Princess Alexandra of Denmark did little to curb his hedonistic tendencies. His liaisons with various mistresses, including the infamous Nellie Clifton, were the stuff of tabloid fodder. Even as king, Edward's scandals continued, though they did little to diminish his popularity. His charm and wit endeared him to the public, and his reign, though short, was marked by a return to the splendor and opulence of the monarchy. In many ways, Edward was the quintessential playboy, his life a series of escapades and extravagances that commanded the affection of his subjects. So, without Edward VII, there's no Bruce Wayne? I think we need to go deeper. No discussion of royal romances would be complete without Henry VIII, the monarch whose matrimonial maneuvers reshaped the entire English court. Henry's court was a microcosm of his desires, a world where affairs and intrigues flourished, provided they didn't impede the king's own ambitions. Henry's 6 marriages, each more tumultuous than the last, were accompanied by a series of mistresses who bore him illegitimate children. His affair with Mary Boleyn, sister to the ill-fated Anne Boleyn, was just one of the many entanglements that defined his reign. The king's pursuit of Anne Boleyn led to a seismic shift in English history, resulting in the break from the Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England. Henry's court was a dangerous place for those who crossed him. Noblemen and courtiers, once favored, could find themselves disgraced, or worse, executed if they fell out of the king's favor. Yet amidst this, or because of this, treacherous landscape, Henry's passions left an indelible mark on the annals of history and pop culture, including the popular Broadway musical, Six, which takes on the monarchy, feminism, and historical reframing through some catchy-ass pop tunes. George I's court was a curious blend of German efficiency and English skepticism. As the first monarch of the House of Hanover, George's arrival in England was met with suspicion and intrigue. His marriage to Sophia Dorothea of Celle was a disaster, resulting both in her imprisonment and George's affair with the Duchess of Kendal. Jeez, insult to injury. George's mistresses wielded significant influence, and his court was rife with gossip and scandal. Yet George's stoic demeanor and focus on governance helped him navigate the treacherous waters of English politics. His legacy, though overshadowed by his son's more flamboyant reign, set the stage for the Hanoverian dynasty's stability and prosperity. From passionate marriages to scandalous love affairs, the private lives of British monarchs have shaped the course of history. These stories of love and lust, set against the backdrop of political intrigue and societal change, remind us that beneath the crowns and titles, kings and queens are driven by the same desires and follies that define the human experience.
Intimacy is a big part of being human. After all, it's how we make more humans. But sex for pleasure has been viewed differently throughout the ages. Way back when, the ancient Greeks had some surprising views on the subject of intimacy, and some attitudes and practices best left in the past. So, today, we're pulling the robes off of what sex was like in ancient Greece. Okay? Time to get it on. Get the video on. The ancient Greeks played an integral role in forming modern society. We have a lot to thank the Greeks for, from systems of governments to aspects of the justice system and even plumbing. So you know who to blame the next time your toilet backs up into the kitchen. Not all practices stood the test of time, though, as dating in ancient Greece was a far cry from modern romance. Ancient Greece's views on intimacy were far less conservative than contemporary societies. Doing the dirty with both men and women was the norm in Athens, and men often took on protégés who doubled as passive physical partners. Bumping uglies actually played an important role in culture and societal hierarchy in ancient times. Relations between men were not only accepted but encouraged. There was no word for homosexuality either. The practice was part of the broader concept of aphrodisia, uninfluenced by gender. However, this doesn't mean it was a golden age for same-sex relationships. Historians believe ancient Athenian men regarded dominance in intimate relationships as a status symbol. If a man acted as the passive partner, pathikos, he often endured ridicule. The ancient Athenians had a derogatory name for these men, kineti. Man, that word even sounds unfriendly. Conversely, ancient Greece's relaxed view of sex included some practices that are considered reprehensible in modern society. Pederasty, or when a man took on a boy student, usually a teen, as a protege and physical partner, is arguably the most notorious. The act reflected attitudes about domination and submission in Greek culture, as intimate relations were more about satisfying the dominant partner than the submissive one. Plato's Symposium suggests this relationship between two men, specifically between a man and a youth, is the purest form of his definition of love, as it has roots in the desire to share knowledge and worldviews. Physical intimacy was merely a bonus, sort of like the ancient world's version of friends with benefits. Greece did not always welcome these attitudes. By around 450 BCE, there were laws against sexual profligacy. Though the laws mostly applied to men, they affected a person's ability to run for office, which was not possible for women. Still, it is believed that there was a large discrepancy between official laws and actual custom, sort of like how some people treat stop signs more like a suggestion than a rule. Some religions paint sex as a sinful act unless performed by a husband and wife. But the ancient Greeks attached little to no religious significance to sex whatsoever, leading to their accepting attitudes of different interests. Nudity wasn't shameful, hence all the naked people in ancient Greek art. Public plays and artwork could also depict eyebrow-raising acts worthy of a giant adults-only sign. For the ancient Greeks, sex was also pivotal in their humor. Aristophanes, one of Greece's great comic writers, wrote particularly raunchy plays. The Athenian women in Lysistrati, for instance, embarked on a sex strike in an attempt to end the Peloponnesian War. The play brims with jokes about promiscuity, double entendres, and bawdy humor. Allegedly, Aristophanes had 106 ways to describe the phallus and some 91 words for female genitalia. There was also raunchy graffiti scrawled throughout Greece, which was more or less exactly like the kind you see in bathroom stalls. No, seriously. It's so obscene we can't mention it here, so go look it up. To the ancient Greeks, depicting male genitalia in art was not an indecent act. The Herm, a statue of the god Hermes, aka the messenger god and guardian of fertility, was one such portrayal. The god's bust sits atop an unadorned pillar, save for a realistically rendered phallus at the appropriate level. Herms sat outside people's houses, near temples, at crossroads. People even used them as signposts. In 415 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, a Vandal chopped off the genitals of the Hermes of Athens. Some accused an Athenian statesman, Alcibiades, of the vandalism. He denied the charges, and his enemies sentenced him to execution in absentia. They took their statues very seriously. In ancient Greece, with sex being so matter-of-fact, it's reasonable to assume sexual self-gratification too would appear less taboo. Though it wasn't considered as uncouth a conversational topic as it is in modern times, self-gratification was usually an object of humor, as in Aristophanes' play where the public deemed it an inferior, silly act. Forms of self-gratification took prominence in art, but they often depicted lesser non-citizens, such as women partaking in the act. These illustrations often showed self-pleasure during or after a physically charged event, such as a symposium. Frequently, it was the female workers pleasuring themselves, not the men. Self-pleasure was also associated with slaves as a symbol of their lowly status. Coitus had widespread acceptance in Greek society, but to pleasure oneself without another person involved was embarrassing by Greek standards. Despite their comparatively liberal views on sex, romantic kissing was considered taboo. Kissing was more the domain of greetings. Later, the Romans, who adapted much from Greek cultures, greeted one another with a kiss on the lips. In ancient Greece, kisses between families and pacts between men were more socially acceptable than kisses between men and women in public. Regardless of their relationship, the public viewed women who passionately kissed others disreputable and domineering, an undesirable trait, as women were expected to play a passive role. If a man did opt to kiss his wife, it was likely to check if she was drinking when he was away. The patriarchal norms of ancient Greece, combined with mythology filled with gods snatching up human women, implied that assault was not a heinous offense. The Greek gods, particularly Zeus, were notorious for tricking women into having sex with them. Turns out Mount Olympus was full of close-up magicians. Though the gods weren't like the aspirational, flawless figures of other religions, it's clear the attitudes toward assault were more relaxed back then. In fact, seducing a married woman was allegedly a worse crime, as it required one man to treat another man's property as his own, making it a kind of theft. Herodotus's writings, which were reportedly echoed by the Greeks, said that while forcing oneself on someone was unjust, it did not need avenging. The Greeks valued sex as part of their culture, which meant not having it was a problem, so they devised all kinds of cures for impotence. Treatments involving snakes were popular because they believed snakes could self-heal, which, no, they can't. You're thinking of geckos, ancient Greeks. Likewise, since lizards had associations with prowess in the bedroom, consuming a lizard allegedly improved the libido. Another cure entailed rubbing male genitalia with a mixture of pepper and honey. Some ancient Greeks hypothesized that simply feeling anxiety about sex could cause impotence. However, these remedies were all male-focused. As with many things in ancient Greece, little was written about women's intimate problems or medicinal solutions. Sex work was a legal occupation for both men and women in ancient Greece. Athenian women were largely homemakers, and they required an escort to venture out into the city. Some women, like ladies of the night, concubines, and courtesans, had a little more freedom due to their status in Greek society. There were also state-run bordellos in ancient Greece. These parlors typically offered enslaved people, but some women became porne, or streetwalkers. Concubines were a somewhat higher class, as they usually had a contract with one man rather than to a bordello. Courtesans were the highest class. They had an education and could entertain men with both their wit and body. Think Inara in Firefly. However, there was still a stigma. Male sex workers couldn't work in public service later in life. The common belief was that people who sold their bodies could easily succumb to political bribes. In English, love means everything from what we feel for our families, to romantic love, or to our enjoyment of the latest Transformers movie. In ancient Greece, this wasn't the case. There were different types of love, and each had distinct words and gods associated with it. Aphrodite, one of the most famous deities of love, reigns over intimate love. Today, the word aphrodisiac was derived from her name, in case you were wondering. Similarly, the god Eros ruled over intimate passion, and the word erotic stems from his name. If there weren't a specific god to rule over a particular type of love, the ancient Greeks had unique words for them. Ludus is a playful, fun love, the kind often found between children or honeymoon stage lovers, while agape is a form of altruistic universal love. Prama refers to long-lasting love cultivated over time. Hangry describes one's love for Snickers, etc. These aren't all of the love types defined in Greek society, but by having a variety, they could separate desire, romance, relations, and play to emphasize their beliefs about each concept. Meanwhile, we just have the one word, but it is surprisingly versatile and is likewise used to describe many different types of affection. Maybe those Greeks were onto something.
The Great Depression was far more depressing than it was great. And like any national crisis worth its salt, it took its toll on everyone's sexual relationships. Millions were suffering under catastrophic economic conditions, so dating wasn't really on anyone's mind. In fact, as a result of all the turmoil and strife, sexual attitudes of the era changed dramatically in some surprising ways, and not always for the better. So, today we're going to take a look at what dating was like during the Great Depression. Okay, at least love don't cost a thing. The Roaring Twenties were so awesome, they decided to call them the Roaring Twenties, which is an impressive nickname for a decade. But as is usually the case, the good times wouldn't last. Starting in 1929, the world began to experience such an unprecedented economic downturn that the period was dubbed the Great Depression. The Depression brought with it mass unemployment, and that left most people's lives as little more than a daily struggle to survive. That, in turn, caused marriage rates to decline, families to shrink, and the roles of men and women in society to change in some fairly complex ways. People still found ways to express their sexuality and expend their pent-up sexual energy. But the liberal attitudes about sex that had flourished during the 20s disappeared during the 30s. As American culture turned more traditional about sex, people increasingly looked elsewhere for activities to wean themselves off of it. Swing dancing and the jitterbug, for example, were dances that became popular during the time. Swing dancing during a sexual fast is arguably playing with fire, but doing the jitterbug will all but guarantee your celibacy. Sporting events provided another outlet and distraction during the Great Depression. Men and women listened to baseball games on the radio, visited boxing matches, and became increasingly involved in football as a means of escape that didn't involve any smooching. These days, shirtless men with sledgehammers are used to sell everything from calendars to pickup trucks. But back in the Great Depression, these kinds of images were associated with the numerous government programs that ran as part of FDR's New Deal, including the Civilian Conservation Corps. The programs allowed men to earn money working the land while finding camaraderie with other men in the exact same situation. At the same time, the government, aware of how unemployment had damaged the collective male psyche, promoted propagandic images portraying the American man as virile and strong. This determination to recoup the male image spilled over into New Deal-era art and literary portrayals of men as well. Soon enough, there was a depiction of a muscular, bare-chested, tough guy waiting around every corner. The modern beefcake was born. As for the ladies, this newfound acceptance for bearing skin slowly encouraged them to begin showing off their stomachs on the beach. And when no one landed in jail because of it, they started doing the same in day-to-day life, and even on social occasions. Meanwhile, as some people were still wrapping their heads around the idea of bare-chested men and bare midriffed women, others were ditching clothing altogether. The nudism movement, which was already popular in Europe, thrived during the first decades of the 20th century thanks to its association with naturalism. However, the movement faced opposition, and it petered out. Relaxed ideas about showing skin during the Great Depression, however, allowed nudism to become popular again during the early 1930s. There were efforts to ban nudism in major cities like New York and Chicago, but some people also expressed support for the creation of nudist spaces. A group of nudists, for example, bought land in northern Indiana and established a resort at the Lake of the Woods Club in 1933. Lake of the Woods, indeed. Homosexuality was still taboo in America, but during the 1920s, homosexual men were able to openly live in cities like Chicago and San Francisco, albeit in a relatively quiet way. But during the Great Depression, the pendulum swung back the other direction. As soon as the financial outlook turned grim, gay men found themselves being blamed for the economic downturn by weakening the male identity. Drag shows, gay nightclubs, and other so-called pansy parlors began to be shut down en masse. At the same time, same-gender relations were increasingly portrayed as a mental illness, similar to those which affected voyeurs and child molesters. That false association took root and quickly led to the active criminalization of homosexuality. During the Depression, any woman who expressed too much of an interest in sports or not enough interest in men was likely to be suspected of being a lesbian. During that time, being labeled a lesbian could devastate a woman's social or professional life. Furthermore, being an out lesbian was often downright risky. Women who openly chose to be lesbians were perceived to be threats to men, and as we mentioned earlier, masculinity was already considered to be in jeopardy. As a result, many lesbians married men for safety and security, as well as just to avoid the social stigma around homosexuality. Social conditions made it extremely difficult for a gay woman to find a partner, but there were secret expressions a lesbian couple could use to indicate they were living an undercover gay lifestyle. For example, if you heard a lady refer to being in the life, she was probably a lesbian. Women might meet each other anywhere from a university to a prison, but living openly as a couple was difficult and isolating, unless that is, they also happened to be transients. Transient lesbians were generally freer to be themselves than their domestically rooted counterparts, and they could always rely on claims of traveling together for safety and companionship without having to justify their relationships. However, the trade-off was being unhoused during the Great Depression. Despite financial strife and concerns about venereal disease, prostitution remained lucrative throughout the Depression. During the 30s, women could do such work independently or in a house as a ringer. Being a ringer was generally safer and more lucrative, as ringers could have anywhere from 15 to 20 clients per day. But it also required being tested for disease and getting a certificate of health, which both madams and customers vastly preferred. Ringer houses were typically part of a chain of houses, and the women would be registered at a main house. Meanwhile, independent girls had to fend for themselves and were much more likely to be arrested. As a result, sex work underwent a change in authority during the Great Depression, as madams and criminal bosses became increasingly powerful over the girls they employed. Having no job means having no income, and no income makes family life a struggle. So during the Depression, having a lot of kids wasn't ideal. Most couples therefore actively tried to avoid pregnancies, which meant that birth control became essential. The problem was something called the Comstock Act of 1873. The act forbade the U.S. Postal Service and other common carriers from conveying obscene material that might be used to incite a crime, or certain materials related to abortions. But it was also used to silence birth control advocates. Given the change in social priorities, however, many states passed legislation allowing for women to have access to contraception, and women of the time generally welcomed birth control information and devices. Condoms for men were common, but with the push to have women control their own reproductive options, diaphragms and female condoms gave women the ability to actively control the size of their families. It was around this time that early versions of the birth control pill, as well as primitive intrauterine devices, began to revolutionize human reproduction. And as a result, fertility rates during the 1930s sunk to as few as 2 children per woman, down from over 3 just 2 decades earlier. Along with a rise in the use of birth control, the Depression also caused many young couples to decide that marriage just didn't make sense as an economic and familial building block. Instead, couples increasingly started to live together without the legal designation of husband and wife. As one newspaper from the period described it, there were a lot of "we'll get married later on, but meanwhile, let's not wait" romances. Luckily for the wedding industry, the Great Depression ended in 1939. But moving in with someone you really shouldn't have is still going strong to this day.
People have been making whoopee since, well, before there were people. Way back when, which is to say approximately 2 billion years ago, our single-celled ancestors developed sexual reproduction, possibly as a means of creating genetic variation. Over time, as these simple organisms evolved into multicellular creatures, their descendants developed all sorts of shortcuts for getting in the mood and determining who might make the most fertile mates. So, today, we're putting the bedroom under the microscope and examining the scientific reasoning behind our strange sex practices. All right, time to light these mood candles. For science, of course. Philematologists are people who study kissing. Aren't you bummed you didn't take more science classes? According to the findings of these brave smooch crusaders, couples, on average, exchange 9 milliliters of water, 0.7 milligrams of protein, 0.18 milligrams of organic compounds, 0.71 milligrams of fats, and 0.45 milligrams of sodium chloride every time they snog. Does that mean kissing is technically a meal? What's more, anywhere from 10 million to 1 billion bacteria may pass between mouths during a kiss, and a sampling that can include nearly 300 different species of both pathogenic and non-pathogenic organisms alike. In other words, every passionate kiss is sneaking a bunch of its weird friends into the party. So why is it exactly that people develop this taste for each other's lips? Well, kissing can be traced back evolutionarily to our recent apish ancestors. Within the animal kingdom, only humans and their closest great ape relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, engage in the occasional smooch. And yet so few makeout scenes in Planet of the Apes movies. Some scientists believe kissing developed as a means of testing out the genetic viability of potential partners. Since saliva is chock full of hormones and genetic information, these scientists argue that kissing allows for an exchange of info that can be subconsciously processed by the two smoochers. A first kiss can make or break a budding relationship. as the information exchanged may set off incompatibility alarms within a participant's brain. Once a relationship progresses and a couple gets the stamp of approval from their subconscious minds, studies show that an increased frequency of kissing is indicative of a strong, healthy relationship. Some studies have even indicated that men who kiss their partners every morning live up to 5 years longer than men who do not. But perhaps surprisingly, there seems to be no correlation between a relationship's strength and a couple's frequency of engaging in intercourse. Even with all of these alleged benefits, though, today only about half of all cultures across the globe engage in romantic kissing. Europe, Asia, North America, and the Middle East all love themselves a good makeout sesh, while many African, South American, and Central American cultures do not partake in the slobbery snogfests of their fellow hominids. Certain foods, spices, and chemicals are said to help increase libido. Historically, some of the wilder alleged aphrodisiacs have been completely bunk, while others do seem to be scientifically supported. For instance, in traditional Chinese medicine, it is believed that consuming the organ of a tiger will increase male virility. This belief has played a major factor in the widespread poaching of the species and has, at least in part, led to the endangerment of the entire tiger population. Indian rhinoceroses, considered vulnerable rather than endangered, have unfortunately faced a similar fate to tigers, thanks in large part to the use of their horns as a cure for erectile dysfunction within Chinese folk medicine. Despite the fact that there is no evidence that tiger parts and rhino horns can get the male organ working again, an underground market for both persists to this day. Other historic aphrodisiacs include the consumption or smoking of toxins from a bufo toad, along with the consumption of ginseng and ambergris, which is whale vomit. Kinky. Meanwhile, alcohol has proved itself time and again to increase sexual activity through disinhibition. While too much alcohol can prevent people from experiencing sexual pleasure, it seems the right amount can increase sexual desire. Many of you are now realizing you are actually conducting scientific experiments in your 20s. Furthermore, women who drink 1 or 2 glasses of red wine per day have reported both increased sexual desire and improved sexual function. Oh girl, it's sex o'clock somewhere. Many also believe that strawberries, raw oysters, coffee, chocolate, and honey all have aphrodisiac qualities. Among these, coffee and oysters seem to show the most potential, while there is no evidence that either chocolate or honey has any real effect as aphrodisiacs. In the case of coffee, most of its aphrodisiac qualities come from its caffeine. Caffeine gets the blood pumping and your mood up, causing both increased dopamine production and improved sexual performance, and makes you jittery and have to poop. So it's a real mixed bag. As for oysters, they're loaded with zinc. While zinc may not get the blood flowing in the same way as caffeine, it does play an important role in the production of sperm and testosterone, making it a key mineral for male sexual health. Beauty and sexual attraction are different, and the cliché female sexually alluring assets tend to focus on 2 areas of a woman's anatomy, and you probably know which ones we're talking about. But there actually may be some science at work here too. As far as butts are concerned, some believe a well-shaped tush signifies sexual maturity. A slim waist and broad hips demonstrate to potential mates that a woman is not only old enough to bear children, but that she is not yet pregnant, and that her skeletal structure may allow for an easy time in childbirth. Hear that, ladies? You're sexy to the bone. What's more, a correlation may exist between your caboose and the intelligence of your offspring. The glutofemoral fat that women store on their backsides contain long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids that help with fetal brain development. And some babies born to women with larger butts have scored higher on cognitive tests. So shake what your mama gave you may refer to SAT scores. Breasts can also be an indicator of fertility. Most believe that their size and shape can indicate that a woman is of childbearing age and in good health. Some have also theorized that since babies get a rush of oxytocin while breastfeeding, this feel-good association with breasts may simply linger into adulthood. We won't discuss what women find attractive or sexy, but we will touch on one old hackneyed topic. While the perfect Johnson size relies on the specifics of each woman's anatomy, like a lock and key, in general, the size of a dude's crank can positively influence the number of orgasms a woman experiences. Those codpieces might be coming back in fashion. During sex, people can make all sorts of noises, and studies indicate that those who communicate during intercourse, whether verbally or non-verbally, report greater levels of satisfaction. This can increase partner bonding, reducing the risk of infidelity, and increasing the likelihood that the man will stick around if the woman gets pregnant. This could be attributed to the evolutionary development of female vocalizations. Many female primates engage in some form of sexual vocalization, before, during, and after intercourse, and human females can be similar. Female vocalizations differ from male vocalizations in rhythm. While the noises men make in the bedroom are generally uneven, women's usually come in notes of equal length, with equal intervals of time between them. There's music everywhere. While women's bedroom vocalizations generally seem to correlate with contractions of their paravaginal muscles, research has shown that some women manipulate their vocal cadences to set the pace, like a high school track coach. After sex, it's time to smoke a cigarette. At least, that's what old Hollywood would have you believe. But the original link between sex and cigarettes can be traced back much further than the movies. Heading into the 1920s, smoking cigarettes was seen as a taboo for women. Taking notice of this untapped market, famed advertiser Edward Bernays, working on behalf of the American Tobacco Company, leveraged the feminist movement of the day to sell tobacco to women. During New York City's 1929 Easter Parade, for instance, he hired a bunch of women to march along the parade path, smoking cigarettes, like a mobster on a treadmill. He instructed these proud smokers to declare that they were not simply smoking cigarettes, but puffing upon torches of freedom. I guess all those Truth.com PSAs were anti-American. Within the decade, the act of smoking became culturally tethered to sexual liberation. And old Hollywood, barred by government-imposed restrictions on depicting sexual content of any kind, found the euphemism they needed in cigarettes, which effectively became a stand-in for sex. Then, in 1970, President Richard Nixon signed into law a ban on advertising cigarettes on television and radio, prompting many cigarette companies to pivot even harder into the movie market. Thus, in the 1970s and 80s, cigarettes proliferated in movies, which is why everyone in Ghostbusters smokes like a chimney. Maybe Luke Skywalker would have rolled his own smokes if he hadn't been in a galaxy so far, far away. And as movies incorporated increasingly risque scenes into their plotlines, cigarettes worked their way into the bedroom itself. Soon after, just about every movie sex scene was accompanied by a smoke, and many viewers copied the practice. Scientists argue that there does not seem to be a physiological component to this connection. While smoking cigarettes can relax the body, it seems that smoking after sex is more so caused by addictive impulses and learned behavior than anything biological. However, the same cannot be said for sleeping. The act of sex is an activity that often takes place at night, which contributes to tiredness. Brain scans have shown that anxiety centers must go quiet in order to orgasm. This in turn produces a calming effect, leading both sexes to relax afterward. Still, sex tends to make men particularly sleepy. This is because men experience an increase in sleep-inducing chemicals. These include vasopressin, oxytocin, and perhaps most importantly, prolactin, a chemical that, when injected into animals, can put even the most ferocious tiger right to sleep. Probably a rhino, too. So what do you think? Which of these bedroom facts surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.